Hi, I'm Carl Weber. Welcome to Video-Aided Instruction series on how to write a great research paper. Here's a paradox that you may have already noticed if you've watched the earlier programs in this series. Although this is a series on how to write a great research paper, so far we haven't talked much about writing, even though we're more than halfway through the series. It may seem like a paradox, but it really isn't. What we call writing isn't mainly about sitting down at your computer or keyboard or a pad of paper and churning out words and sentences. Writing is much more about preparation, about selecting a great topic, developing an interesting thesis around that topic, learning as much as you can about the topic through smartly targeted research and reading, and then honing your ideas until you have something new, intriguing, and convincing to say in defense of your thesis. So in this sense, writing is a kind of performance. It's a little like acting in a play or performing music on stage. You should expect to spend a lot more time in preparation than in the actual writing, just as an actor or musician spends more time studying the script or the score, planning and thinking about the style and tone of his or her performance, and then rehearsing it repeatedly to get the performance down pat, than actually is spent on stage. Well, we've come a long way. If you've followed the advice and instructions that we've offered in this series so far, you're now ready to start writing. The curtain is about to go up on your first performance. But now a problem that's common to performers may strike. Actors and musicians call it stage fright. Writers call it writer's block. It's the surprising inability that many of us suffer from to actually begin performing, despite the great preparation we may have done. In fact, this sense of freezing up and feeling hesitant to perform may even become worse if you've spent a lot of time preparing. You may have so many great ideas in your head for your paper that when the time comes to begin pouring them out at your keyboard, you can't decide where to begin. And having developed such good raw material, you may feel nervous about the actual writing because you just don't want to blow it at this crucial stage. Well, don't worry. This program is all about getting started with a great writing performance, creating a first draft for your research paper that will capture your good ideas and give you a great basis for sharpening and perfecting a paper that is even better than you've imagined. One of the keys to overcoming writer's block is having a clear sense of where you're going to get started, how to get past the stage of research, reading, thinking, and analysis, and actually begin putting your own ideas on paper. And that means creating an outline, a roadmap for your paper that will make it easier for you to get started with a sense of confidence that you'll reach your final destination. So in this program, we're going to begin by talking about how to create a great outline for your research paper. And then we'll look at some specific techniques that can help you overcome writer's block and get a great first draft down on paper so that you can begin refining, honing, and sharpening it and make it into an A-plus paper. Now, from the compositions and papers that you've written for school in the past, you've probably developed some method of creating an outline for any piece of writing. And if so, that's fine. You don't need to change your system dramatically just because you're now writing a research paper. But if you've never come up with a really good way of organizing your writing, you'll find the following discussion helpful. One key is to keep your outline simple. It's possible that an English teacher somewhere along the line, perhaps in junior high school or high school, taught you a complex method of outlining a paper that involves heads, subheads, and sub-subheads, all labeled with Roman numerals, capital letters, Arabic numerals, lowercase letters, and all carefully indented to show differing levels of importance. I think this kind of complexity for your outline is actually unnecessary and often confusing. A good outline for a 10 to 15-page research paper may consist of nothing more than a sentence stating your thesis and then 5 or 10 phrases or sentences listing the main ideas that you want to include in your paper in the order that makes the most sense. This kind of simple outline is a tool that you can keep by your side as you write, so you'll easily remember what you've just talked about and what topic comes next in your work. Having an outline like this will make it easy for you to stitch one idea to the next and make sure that the flow of ideas from beginning to end of your paper is clear and easy for your reader to follow. And it's also encouraging for you as you do your writing, because you always know what you've just talked about, what you're about to talk about next, and you never have that sense of losing your way or getting confused as you work. But the outline can and should be quite simple. Don't get overly complex or spend too much time organizing your work in any elaborate fashion. It's really not necessary, and for some students it may even be more confusing than helpful. But how do you go about creating a simple outline that's really effective? Here are some suggestions. First, start with your thesis. Now, as you recall, your thesis is simply what you want to say about your topic. Your topic is what the paper is about. The thesis is what do you want to say about the topic. The thesis answers the question that you set about investigating when you began your research. And as we've discussed, a good thesis meets 4 important criteria. First, it's supported by your research findings. In other words, all the things that you learned about when you did your research and reading help to suggest the accuracy and truth of your thesis. Second, your thesis should be a positive, non-obvious statement. In other words, it should be something that is fresh, interesting, and unique to your paper, not something that has been said over and over again by everyone who writes about the topic. It takes a fair amount of reading and thought to come up with a thesis that is a positive, non-obvious statement. Third, your thesis should not be a tautology, that is, something that can't be disproved. For example, when we talked about how to create a great thesis in another program in this series, we gave as an example the idea that Lincoln won the presidential election of 1860 because he managed to amass enough electoral votes from all the regions of the country to put him over the top in the election. Now, this is a tautology. Why? Because that's simply the definition of how you win a presidential election, by getting the most electoral votes. It's not something that could be proved or disproved because it's obviously true. It's part of the basic definition of winning a presidential election. Since it can't be disproved, it's really not worth arguing about, and therefore not worth devoting a 10 to 15-page research paper to demonstrating. If you were writing a paper about how Lincoln managed to win the presidential election of 1860, you'd need to develop a different thesis, one that's not a tautology. And fourth and finally, your thesis should be significant, original, and interesting. If you've done enough research, you have a pretty good sense of what most previous writers about your topic have said and what the most commonplace ideas are in that particular field. Your ideal research paper should be built around a thesis that says something new, fresh, and original, something that your teacher or other readers will be impressed by when they read your paper. They'll say, not only has this student done some great research and learned a lot about the topic, but he or she has also come up with a fresh and original point of view on the topic. That's what it takes to get an A paper, and that's the kind of thesis you want to build your paper around. So these 4 criteria are very important in deciding whether or not you've developed a good thesis for your paper. We discuss these criteria in much more detail in the program titled How to Be Persuasive. So if you haven't watched that program yet, by all means do. Well, your thesis, as you can see, is the heart of your paper. It's the idea that, above all, you want your readers, especially your teacher who will be giving you a grade, to understand and remember. This means that your outline should be organized so as to make the thesis very clear and convincing. So when you sit down to work on your outline, start with the thesis. A good way to start creating your outline is simply to write the thesis in a sentence. Write this sentence on the top of a piece of paper that you're going to use to work on your outline. Forcing yourself to state the thesis in a sentence will ensure that you have a clear, concise thesis, one that is simple and strong enough to be the basis for your 10 to 15-page research paper. It's actually very easy to do all the research and reading for your paper. Have a brain that's filled with many ideas, facts, thoughts, information, and data about the topic, and have a kind of general, vague sense that you know what you want to say. But if you don't force yourself to actually write a sentence stating your thesis, it may remain in the vague stage of being simply a sense or a feeling about the topic, as opposed to a very specific, clear statement of an idea that you want to persuade your reader to agree with. So forcing yourself to actually state your thesis in a sentence is a very important and good exercise. And just having it there written down at the top of the page as you sit down to work on your outline will help you remain focused on the key idea. It will help ensure that your entire outline is built around the thesis and helps to demonstrate it and support it. And that's the basis for a really good paper. Now, here's a sample thesis, which again you might remember from our last program. It's for our paper about President Lincoln and how he managed to win the election of 1860. This thesis states the conclusion that a student reached after studying many historical writings and contemporary documents about that election of 1860. The student was looking for an answer to the question as to how Lincoln was able to win that election. Here's the student's thesis. Lincoln, an obscure politician from the Midwest, was able to win the crucial 1860 election against better-known competitors largely because of a serious miscalculation by his Republican followers, who mistakenly believed that the leaders of the South were not serious about their threats to secede from the Union if Lincoln were elected, and spread this belief among Northern voters. Well, you can see that this thesis grew out of a lot of research, reading, and thought by the student who is writing this particular paper. You can see there's a lot of background information built into this thesis. The student has put Lincoln's election into a broad historical context involving the conflict between North and South that ultimately led to the start of the Civil War. The student has read about how historians have analyzed the electoral situation during that election of 1860. He's analyzed what they've said about the attitudes of people both North and South toward the possibility that Lincoln would be elected. And the student has come to be persuaded by the idea that if Northerners had realized that the South was really serious about seceding from the Union, trying to break up the United States if Lincoln were elected, the Northerners might not have been willing to vote for Lincoln and take that chance. Instead, they made the miscalculation or the mistake of believing that the Southerners weren't quite serious about those threats to secede. They voted for Lincoln thinking that the South would be reconciled and would ultimately stay in the Union without trying to break up the United States. That was a mistake which ultimately led to the Civil War. And the student's contention is that those historians who say that it was a mistake of this kind, a miscalculation that allowed Lincoln to be elected president, those historians are correct. And in the course of the student's paper, he or she is going to try to demonstrate the truth of this statement. Now, it's great to begin working on the outline by writing out the thesis, as this student has done in this sentence. You'll probably find that you'll want to include this sentence somewhere in your actual finished paper, perhaps at or near the beginning, so that your readers will immediately understand your point of view and what idea you're trying to convey in your paper. So writing down this thesis is a good starting point for your outline. Now, once you've stated the thesis and written it down in the form of a sentence on your paper, the next step in creating your outline is to ask, what do I need to say in order to support the thesis? Remember that to be persuasive, your paper must support the thesis in a variety of ways. The ideas stated in the thesis must be explained clearly and fully so that the reader understands exactly what you're saying and what you're not saying. This may involve defining the terms you use in the thesis as precisely and clearly as possible. Factual evidence to back up the truth of the various parts of your thesis also needs to be cited in the paper, including, depending on the nature of the paper, either data from primary sources, that is, things published at the time of the events that you're discussing, ideas from secondary sources, that is, things published later, or perhaps both primary and secondary sources. Also necessary to support the thesis in your paper will be statistics and other numerical data, again, depending on the nature of the topic you're writing about. Also important may be explanations of cause and effect relationships, that is, to narrate events that back up the connections that you propose in your thesis. And finally, information about alternative theses may be needed. That is, you may need to explain what are some other possible explanations or ideas about the topic that you're writing about. And you'll want to include facts and ideas to show why you think these alternative theses are wrong. You have to be able to eliminate alternative explanations in order to focus the reader on the correctness of your main thesis. So all of these are examples of the kinds of backup information, the evidence that you're going to need to cite in your paper in order to support your thesis and convince your reader that your thesis is correct. Not all of these forms of support will be necessary in every thesis, but some of them will be. And the next step in creating your outline is to simply jot down a list of all the supporting ideas you have to choose from. And these, of course, will be drawn from your research. So here's where all the notes and materials that you've gathered during the last few weeks as you've been doing your background reading and research will come in handy. You may be able to jot down your list of supporting evidence simply by thumbing through the note cards or slips of paper that you created as you read through your research sources. As you go through these notes, whenever you come across a strong piece of supporting information that helps to explain your thesis, defend it, clarify it, or sharpen it, write down on your paper a phrase or sentence that summarizes that piece of supporting information. Within a few minutes, you should have a list of these items, supporting elements that you're going to use in your paper to back up your thesis. Now look over this list of supporting details. Does it appear full enough? As you read through it and think about the information that each item refers to, ask yourself, is your thesis being strengthened adequately? That is, do you feel your thesis is going to be adequately proved by the evidence that you're going to cite? Or are there holes in the argument that need to be filled? If that's the case, you may need to do a little additional research if you realize that some aspects of your thesis aren't being sufficiently supported by the evidence you've gathered up to this point. Conversely, you may find that your list includes too many items. For example, you might find that you have a long list of quotations from experts or scholars who support your ideas. You don't necessarily have to include all of those in the paper, so you may have too much of that kind of backup information, and you'll need to be selective about using certain of them without throwing them all into the paper. For another example, you might have a collection of 5 or 6 stories or anecdotes or events which back up your thesis, but it might seem repetitive if you were to include them all. So you may, in some spots, have too little evidence to fully back up your thesis, and in other cases, you may have more than you really need. Remember that you just have 10 to 15 pages to work with for a typical research paper, although, of course, this may vary from one class to another. 10 to 15 pages might sound like a lot, particularly if you haven't written a paper of that length before. But once you start writing, you'll probably find that each piece of supporting evidence you want to include will probably take a page or two to fully and clearly explain. And this means that in 10 to 15 pages for the paper as a whole, you probably only have room for 5 to 10 pieces of supporting evidence to support your thesis. That means you'll probably have to be selective about what items from your research you'll use. Pick just the most important, interesting, and relevant information for your outline. Don't throw in every fact you discovered just to show off how complete your research was. Sometimes scholars will write biographies or historical books which run 600 or 700 or 800 pages, and the reviewers will comment, well, it's obvious that the writer felt obliged to mention every single fact that he or she discovered in the research. Don't write a paper like that. Just focus on what's really necessary to demonstrate the correctness of your thesis, and focus on the most important and relevant details, rather than throwing in the kitchen sink. Now, in the case of our Lincoln thesis, we'll want supporting evidence to back up each part of the thesis. As we saw, the sentence describing that thesis was rather long and complex, referred to a lot of historical events, forces, and interrelationships. So let's look at the thesis piece by piece and think about what kinds of supporting evidence would be needed to back up each part of the thesis. The thesis begins by saying that Lincoln was an obscure politician from the Midwest competing against better known competitors. This is a statement that needs to be backed up with some evidence or information. You might, for example, want to quote some statements from contemporary documents. Perhaps there are newspaper articles or editorials or even comments by some of Lincoln's rivals or other politicians of the time, talking about the fact that Lincoln did not have much of a national reputation, that he wasn't considered one of the leading candidates for the presidency in 1860, at least not early in the year. And you might want to find some contemporary statements that contrast Lincoln to his better-known rivals. You might also find some comments that historians evaluating the race years later said, which make the same point. And you might want to briefly summarize Lincoln's career up to that point and show how he actually had less national experience than some of the other politicians who were contending for the presidency in 1860. You'll need to spend a page or two in your paper justifying the statement that Lincoln was an obscure politician and that his rivals were better known. And these are examples of some of the kind of backup information that would tend to support that part of the thesis. Now, the thesis then goes on to refer to a serious miscalculation by Lincoln's Republican followers who mistakenly believed that the leaders of the South were not serious about their threats to secede from the Union if Lincoln were elected, and they spread this belief among Northern voters. Now, this is the key statement in the thesis, since it explains what you, the writer, believe was the fundamental reason, or at least an important reason, for Lincoln's election. That is, this miscalculation or misunderstanding by Republican followers of Lincoln. To demonstrate that this part of the thesis is correct, you'll need a few kinds of evidence. Here are some examples. You'll probably need stories, anecdotes, documents, or statements from the time, from 1860, which show that Republicans did in fact believe that the Southern leaders weren't serious about secession. You'll need to define your terms carefully. You'll need to demonstrate that the people that you are quoting or referring to in your paper were in fact Republican followers of Lincoln. You'll need to show that they were in fact members of the Republican Party and that they were supporters of Lincoln. Otherwise, your thesis will fall apart if the people that you quote don't actually fit the definition that you include in the thesis. In the same way, in your thesis, you refer to leaders of the South. You'll need to define who you mean by leaders of the South. Talk about perhaps members of the Senate from the South, governors, opinion makers such as editorial writers at leading Southern newspapers. You'll have to define who you mean by leaders of the South. This is another kind of evidence that would be important to include in the paper to support and clarify the thesis. You'll need further evidence to show that Lincoln's Republican supporters spread this belief, that is, the belief that the South wasn't serious about secession, that they spread this belief among Northern voters. For example, you might want to find the text of a speech that one of Lincoln's prominent supporters made to Northern voters, in which he said, the South is not really going to succeed. They are just making idle threats, and if Lincoln becomes president, the country will go on much as before. If you could find a speech like this, that would go a long way toward demonstrating the truth of your thesis. If you don't find a speech, perhaps you can find letters to the editor or articles in newspapers or letters written from one Republican supporter to a group of Republicans in another town in which the same claim is made. Documents of this kind would all go a long way toward helping to prove that the thesis is correct. And this is another example of the kind of evidence that you would want to include in the paper to demonstrate this particular thesis. Finally, you would also need evidence to show that this particular belief about the intentions of the South made a difference in some voters' choices on Election Day. For example, perhaps you found in your research a diary from a Northern voter in which he said, one of my reasons for voting for Lincoln was because I don't believe the South is really serious about secession. If you can find one or more statements like this, they'd be wonderful pieces of evidence to help to show that your thesis is correct. So each part of the thesis needs to be defended and supported with a certain amount of evidence. And as you go through your research notes with your thesis in mind, you'll want to jot down on your potential outline each of the key pieces of evidence that you've uncovered so that you'll be sure to include them when you go ahead to write your paper. All of these separate points that we've just talked about would need to be demonstrated and proved in order to establish a chain of cause and effect relationships. That is, that the Northern Republicans did in fact make this miscalculation about the South, that they spread this idea among Northern voters, and that Northern voters relied on this belief in voting for Lincoln. If you can demonstrate that this cause and effect chain did in fact happen, you would demonstrate the accuracy of the thesis. Hopefully, in your research, you've uncovered evidence to support all the main points that are involved in your thesis. If not, you'll need to revise the thesis. You'll need to come up with a thesis that in fact states accurately the conclusion or conclusions that your research actually points to. If you're missing the evidence, then you've probably got a faulty thesis at this point. You may have come up with a thesis that isn't really supported by the facts that your research has uncovered. Now is the time to revise the thesis as necessary in order to state what your research actually supports. If you do have enough evidence, however, then jot down a list of all the best pieces of evidence that you're going to use to support each key concept. And now you have the raw material for your outline. Finally, the last step in creating the outline is simply to organize these ideas in a sequence that's effective and appropriate. Choosing the right details to include is one key step in outlining, and the next is getting the right details in the right order. To do this, look at the details that you've listed and ask yourself, what shape do these ideas suggest? That is, what logical structure do the ideas you want to convey seem to fit into? If there's a clear answer to that question, then that will tell you how to organize your materials for the outline. Now, fortunately, you don't have to come up with a logical structure for your paper from scratch. You don't have to make it up just from your own head. There are certain classic structures that work and that have been used time and again for excellent research papers. And it's quite likely that one of these will work for your paper. Let's consider each of these classic outline structures in turn. Chances are good one of them will work for your outline. First, narrative sequence. A paper outlined according to a narrative sequence is one that tells an overall story. Here you're describing a number of events that are logically linked to one another, and the structure of your paper will be basically chronological. That is, you'll organize your details and ideas according to time sequence. Now, you might use narrative sequence structure for a paper on Lincoln's election. After all, it would be recounting a major event in U.S. history, the election of 1860, and showing how it came to pass. So it might make sense to recount the events around the election in order, emphasizing and focusing on the events that relate to your thesis about Republican beliefs related to Southern feelings about secession. So if you were to organize this paper according to narrative sequence, you'd begin by discussing statements made by both Southerners and Northerners before Lincoln's nomination. You'd continue with events during the election campaign, and you'd tell about things that people said and did after the election itself. Of course, you'd conclude by showing what ultimately happened after Lincoln became president. Naturally, you wouldn't try to tell the complete story of the election. That would probably include enough material to fill an entire book. Instead, you'd be focusing on the events that relate specifically to your thesis. But your paper would read like a story in that it would describe the events in the order in which they happened. It might seem obvious that a narrative sequence works well for a history paper, but it can also be used in many other types of papers. If you were writing a paper for a science class, for example, you might choose to use a narrative sequence to describe, for example, how a series of experiments was conducted, what the scientists had in mind when they began the series of experiments, what kinds of protocols they followed in setting up the experiments, what the results were like, and what conclusions were drawn at at the end. That tells a kind of story, a narrative sequence from the earliest events to the later ones, and it illustrates how a science paper could well be written using this particular structure. And the same could be true of a paper in the humanities, the social sciences, or many other types of fields. A narrative sequence is a fine way of organizing a paper because it creates a clear thrust from beginning to end and makes it easy for your reader to follow the logic of the paper. It's one good kind of outline to use. Here's a second: cause and effect. In this classic outline structure, you organize your paper under two main headings: cause or causes, and effect or effects. In other words, your main goal here is to show how one or more events or forces helped lead or produce one or more specific results or outcomes. Now, this structure, this cause and effect structure, could be used for many kinds of papers. For example, in a literature class, you could use a cause and effect structure to show how certain stylistic or philosophical influences led a particular writer to produce a specific kind of book. If you were writing about Moby Dick, for example, you could show how Melville's readings of the classics and of the Bible influenced the symbolism that he used in Moby Dick, and this would be a cause and effect structure. In a science class, you could show how one set of natural forces produces a particular set of results as illustrated by scientific studies. Or if you were writing about the history of science, for example, you could use a cause and effect structure to show some influences on the development of a particular scientific idea. In this series, for instance, we've talked about how Charles Darwin developed the theory of evolution, and we've discussed the fact that he delayed for many years to publish the theory after developing it. Many historians have speculated as to reasons why. If you were writing a paper about this topic, you could organize it according to a cause and effect structure, outlining what you think were the causes of Darwin's delay in publishing his theory, and then showing the effects, how his delay had an impact on the history of science. A third type of structure is comparison and contrast. This is another classic structure for a research paper, and as the name implies, it's based on comparing and contrasting two things. They could be any two things. For example, two critical approaches to the same topic. For example, you could write a literature paper comparing and contrasting the views of two scholars on the symbolism in Moby Dick. You could compare and contrast two events, figures, or movements from history. For example, suppose you were taking a course on the history of the civil rights movement. You could compare and contrast how the reputations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X have changed in the years since their death. Those would be two different evolutions that you would be describing and showing the similarities and differences between them. Or you could compare and contrast two theories from science. For example, two different scientists' ideas about the timing of the first migrations of humans to the New World from Eurasia. So again, comparison and contrast is a structure that can be used for many different types of papers in many different topics. A paper outlined according to the comparison and contrast structure would probably be divided into two sections, each one devoted to one of the two things being compared. You'd want to be careful to make sure that all of the same points are discussed in relation to each of the two things so that the comparison would be complete and balanced. For example, suppose you were comparing and contrasting how the reputations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X had evolved in the years since their death. If you talk about how Martin Luther King's reputation has evolved among average citizens, among historians and scholars, and among civil rights leaders, you would want to be sure to discuss all of those same 3 points in relation to Malcolm X as well. Otherwise, you would have a comparison that doesn't really hang together, and it wouldn't really be balanced between the two parts of the comparison. So one of the requirements when you use a comparison and contrast structure is that you are consistent and balanced and follow all the same elements in each of the two things that you are comparing and contrasting. Another type of structure, which is a specific type of comparison and contrast, is the pro and con structure. Here you'd present a particular idea, theory, concept, or approach to a topic, and then discuss the arguments for and against that idea. This is especially appropriate when you're analyzing an idea that's new or controversial. In the end, you'd want in your paper to present your own evaluation of the idea and explain whether or not you agree with it. That is, whether you come down on the pro side or the con side. However, no matter which way you lean, you want to fairly and accurately present all the main arguments on both sides, even though you're going to disagree with some of them for reasons which, of course, you'll explain in your paper. So when approaching a topic that involves strong, contrasting opinions, you may want to organize your paper according to the pro and con structure. Show the arguments on both sides, and then tell which ones you agree with most and why. Finally, thesis and evidence. Our last outline structure is thesis and evidence, and it's the loosest form of organization that you might normally consider for a research paper. Thesis and evidence simply involves stating your thesis and then presenting the evidence for it, point by point, in some sequence that feels clear and logical. If none of the other structures that we've described seems to fit your paper naturally, then consider a thesis and evidence outline. It still leaves open the question of exactly what order you would put the evidence, and here we'll have some suggestions in a minute that could be helpful. But the thesis plus evidence structure is one that's kind of a one-size-fits-all structure. It could be used for almost any paper. So if you're at a loss as to how to outline your ideas, consider using this structure, which simply involves stating your thesis and then going through the key pieces of evidence one by one, point A, B, C, D, E, and so on, until you've outlined your complete argument. These then are some of the classic ways of organizing your information and ideas into an outline. Once you've done this, how do you know if your outline works well, if it's going to lead to a good and convincing paper? What makes a good outline? Here are some principles that I'd suggest that will help you judge whether you've created an effective outline or not. First, spill the beans. This is an old expression that just means say it, don't hide it. It's amazing how often students will simply fail to express the main idea of their paper very clearly. You can often read a research paper and come away feeling uncertain or confused as to what the thesis of the paper was supposed to be. One test of a good outline is whether it clearly states the thesis, preferably early in the paper, so that the reader doesn't need to waste time guessing what your central conclusion will be. Next, eliminate the irrelevant. Look at all of the facts and ideas that you include in your outline and ask yourself about each one, what does this have to do with my thesis? Each one should have some clear purpose and some clear relationship to the thesis. It should either help to prove the thesis, it should raise and answer an important question about it, it should clarify what it means, or it should provide a necessary background for understanding it. If you've included an idea in your paper just because it was interesting or surprising, or it was hard to find and you were very proud of uncovering it, and it's really not relevant to the thesis, then you need to eliminate it. You may be reluctant to do that because you may love the fact. It may be a great story. It may be a wonderful quotation. It may be terribly tempting. But if it's irrelevant, ultimately it will hurt the paper more than it will help it. So go through your outline very rigorously and ask about each detail. Is this really useful in supporting or otherwise strengthening my thesis? If the answer is no, then take it out. Your paper will end up being more unified, more understandable, more logical as a result, and you'll probably end up with a higher grade. Next, start and finish strong. Now, sometimes your overall structure will dictate the exact order of items in your paper. For example, suppose you use the narrative sequence. Then obviously the items will be arranged in chronological order from the earliest to the latest. But in other cases, there may be no particular reason why one fact should go first, another second, and another third. When this is the case, I suggest looking for the two ideas that you consider the most compelling, the most interesting, and the most convincing, the ones that are going to impress your reader the most. Put one of them first in the paper and the other one last. The reason for this strategy is simple. Those two locations, the beginning and the end, are the ones that get the most emphasis. Readers will notice and remember how you start your paper and how you end it. They may or may not remember what comes in the middle. So always put two of your strongest ideas at the beginning and the end. This trick will leave your readers feeling more impressed with your paper than if the facts are arranged in random order. So when in doubt as to how to organize the details in your paper, use this trick. Start strong and end strong, and you'll find that the paper will benefit as a result. Now you have a pretty good outline to rely upon in writing the first draft of your paper. It's built around a good solid thesis, and it lists in a reasonable sequence all the main points or ideas or pieces of information that you want to include in your paper. For many students, having an outline like this is all they need to get started on writing their first draft. They sit down and away they go. But for some others, writer's block becomes a problem that intervenes and prevents them from making progress. Writer's block can take a number of different forms. For some people, it's a mysterious reluctance to actually sit down at the keyboard and begin work. Those people always seem to find other more interesting things to do. Their friends call them up and say, hey, let's go out, and they say, oh, sure, I'll go out with you. I can always work on the paper tomorrow. Or there's always a TV show or something on the internet that's more interesting than working on the paper. Some other people actually manage to sit down at the keyboard or the computer and find themselves staring at the screen, paralyzed, unable to begin writing. Perhaps they're nervous about putting something down on paper. They're thinking about the reaction of their teacher or other readers and thinking, oh, these ideas are no good. Nobody wants to read this. What was I thinking about? I have no idea what to say. This is going to be a failure. I'm going to get an F in this paper. I might as well just drop out of school. People can spiral into depression and anxiety when faced with that blank computer screen. And if this happens to you, believe me, I understand. Maybe it'll make you feel better to know that even professional writers like me can suffer from writer's block. Here are some tips that professional writers have developed over the years to master the problem. And I suggest you try one of these next time you have a paper due and feel unable to get started. Here's our first suggestion. Say it in a single sentence. If you find yourself suffering from writer's block, one way to get started may be to simply try to summarize your paper in a single sentence. In fact, if you've already written down your thesis, that may be the sentence. Type it into your computer and then start building on that starting point. To write the second sentence, just begin elaborating on the first sentence. For example, you could choose a particular idea, one phrase from the sentence, and start explaining it in more detail. You could define one of the key terms that it contains, or begin to describe some evidence that supports that sentence, or just develop a particular detail more fully. Soon, your single sentence will have turned into a paragraph of 3 or 4 sentences, and you may find yourself beginning to build up a head of steam. For many people, once the ice has been broken by actually beginning work, continuing to write is not so difficult. So try saying it in a single sentence, and you may find that's all you need to get off the schneid. Here's another suggestion. Write down what you'd tell a friend. I know a wonderful educational consultant named Lorraine Monroe who years ago found herself advising a fellow student who was working on a PhD thesis, had done great research and had lots of good ideas, but just couldn't seem to get started on the writing. Finally, Lorraine sat down with her friend across a table and said to the friend, tell me, what is it you're trying to say in your paper? And the friend said, well, what I'm trying to say is X. And she explained the main idea of the paper. Lorraine said, write that down, write that down. Sure enough, the friend wrote down that sentence, and then Lorraine said, okay, what else are you trying to say in the paper? And the friend said, well, I guess the next point would be, and Lorraine said, write that down, write that down. Pretty soon, the student had a complete first draft of the paper and was able to go on and successfully complete the PhD. So if you're unsure how to start writing, try this technique on yourself. Imagine that you're sitting down across from a friend who asks you, what exactly are you trying to say in your paper? Think about what you would say if you were to answer out loud to that question, and then just write down exactly what you're thinking. Imagine then a follow-up question, which might be a very simple one. What exactly do you mean by that? Or why do you believe that? Or why is that important? write down the answer, and pretty soon you'll have written several sentences that define your basic message. Later on, you'll revise and sharpen them and make the style appropriate to a research paper, but writing down just what you would say in conversation to a friend is a good way to break the ice and get you started on writing the paper as a whole. Another technique: just start writing. For many writers, something called free writing is a great way of breaking through writer's block. Free writing means writing in stream of consciousness style, sitting at your keyboard or with a pad of paper and simply writing down whatever comes to mind. Now don't worry, you may find that your free writing turns out to be gobbledygook, and actually that's all right. You might find yourself, for example, writing something like this. Here I am sitting at my computer trying to write this darned paper. I wish I knew what to write. I wish even more I didn't have to write it. I'd rather be out with my friends. But the paper is due this week, so I have to write something. Maybe I should start by talking about what I read in that book yesterday. It was kind of interesting. The author said something about Lincoln that was really surprising. And you go on from there. Eventually, when you do this kind of stream of consciousness, free writing, you'll probably find yourself writing about the topic of your paper, especially if you've immersed yourself in the subject over the last few weeks. Once that happens, all you have to do later is go back and delete all the irrelevant gobbledygook that you started with. If free writing doesn't appeal to you, try some other kind of writing. For example, writing letters or emails or instant messages to your friends. Very often, doing some kind of writing, any kind, is enough to warm up those writing muscles and help you get going on your paper. So if you feel frozen when it comes to writing about the topic of your paper, sit down and start writing anything. Chances are good that will warm you up and enable you to start writing and eventually turn to the paper itself. Next technique, play with blocks. Student writers often feel intimidated by the idea of writing a 10 to 15 page paper or an even longer research paper, particularly if they've never written something of that size before. So don't think of it as a 10 to 15 page paper. Instead, think of it as 5 to 10 short blocks of writing about separate topics. Each topic is a different idea that you listed in your outline. Start writing just one block at a time, thinking only about that one idea. State the idea in a sentence, and then write a few paragraphs to give all the necessary details and facts that explain it clearly. Once you've finished that block, which might run 1 or 2 pages in length, give yourself a little reward. Take a short break. Watch a little TV, play a video game, have a soda, chat with a friend. Then sit down and tackle the next block. If you write a few blocks like this every day, soon you'll have all the pieces you need to assemble into a complete paper. All you then have to do is connect them with linking phrases or sentences to show how one idea leads into the next. So if you find yourself feeling nervous because you are intimidated by the idea of writing a 10 to 15 page paper, forget about it. Don't think of it as a 10 to 15 page paper. Think about it as a series of small little pieces. You're good at writing 1 page at a time. Just write 1 page, take a little break, and then move on to the next page. Before you know it, you'll have a complete draft. Next, start with what you can write most easily. Now, sometimes what you've listed in your outline as being the first idea or two may seem difficult to write about. It may be, for example, that the first couple of items in your outline deal with ideas that you find confusing or boring or complicated or hard to explain, so that starting at the beginning may actually make it harder for you to get the paper done. Well, the good news is that there's no law that says you have to start at the beginning. If you're stuck, try looking through your entire outline and pick the topic that seems easiest to write about, the one that's most interesting, simple, clear, and fun. Write that. Maybe it appears somewhere in the middle or toward the end of your paper, and then move on to another block that links to it in some way. Soon you'll find that you've got several blocks of your paper written, and your self-confidence is rising and your creative juices are flowing. And eventually you'll be ready to tackle the hardest parts, the ones that intimidated you at the beginning, but which no longer seem quite so difficult. Next, don't be a perfectionist. Sometimes the smartest and most accomplished students are the ones who suffer the worst cases of writer's block. The reason is that they set very high standards for themselves, and they try to earn an A on every paper they write, and they refuse to be satisfied with anything less than their very best work. Now, this is a great attitude to have, and it will help you go far in life. But when you're trying to get started on a paper, this attitude of perfectionism may create paralysis. If you're too worried about making that first sentence or that first paragraph perfect, you may find it hard to get it down on paper. You start thinking of things to write, and you start judging your words even as you think about them. Oh, that's no good. That's not right. That's not how I mean to say it. That's not the best word. Oh, I don't even remember exactly what I was trying to say. And soon, when you get into that state of mind, your work will grind to a halt as you struggle to make that first sentence or that first paragraph perfect. This is where the saying comes from that the perfect is the enemy of the good. Don't worry about making your work perfect at first. Just get something down on paper. Make it good, not perfect. After all, remember, you'll have plenty of opportunity later to revise, expand, streamline, clarify, fix words, and otherwise improve your work. Think of your first draft just as raw material, which is going to be honed and perfected later. It's like a crude block of wood that a sculptor begins work on and ultimately shapes into a beautiful, well-designed work of art. Don't expect it to look like a great work of art when you begin work. Instead, just get something, anything, down on paper. If you don't get that imperfect first draft written, you may never get the chance to improve it later. So if you know that you're a perfectionist, try to break that attitude and that habit for the first session of writing. Just get something down and worry about making it good later. Next, experiment with writing in different times and places. Writing is very much a matter of mood. Maybe you'll find that writing at 2 a.m. works best for you, or at dinner time, or maybe you'll find it easiest to write in the school cafeteria surrounded by noise of plates and conversations. Maybe you find it easiest to write with loud music playing or sitting in the park. Or maybe you're more like me, that you need to be in your room at home with the door shut and with total silence surrounding you. Everyone is different, and for many people, the conditions that they prefer for writing vary and change from time to time. You may find that the environment that works for you on Monday is very different and doesn't work very well on Wednesday. So all of that is fine. The important thing is to be flexible and keep experimenting with yourself. Try different settings, different environments, different times until you find a setup that works for you. Next, give yourself time. Write a page or two a day. A final suggestion for beating writer's block is to get started early. The worst cases of writer's block often arise when the deadline for handing in the paper is just a couple of days away. The pressure is very intense. You have this awareness hanging over you that you're not going to have much time to revise and improve your work. And under those circumstances, it's easy to freeze up and give in to despair and say, oh my gosh, I'm never going to get this done. Why even try? To avoid this problem, try to time your planning, research, reading, and note-taking work so that you end up with at least 10 days to 2 weeks between the time when you finish those preliminary stages and when your finished paper is due. That means you'll have plenty of time both to create a good first draft and to revise and fix it, even if you only write a page or two per day. The pressure will be off. You'll be able to write without feeling as if your grade depends on being perfect the first time you put your hands on the keyboard. Now, as a professional writer, I can tell you that all of these tricks are very helpful, but none of them is foolproof. Writer's block is a problem that never entirely goes away, even if you spend a lifetime as a writer. So, if you suffer from writer's block occasionally, don't beat yourself up over it. Accept the fact that once in a while you'll have a day or a night or even a whole weekend that isn't very productive. Just be sure that when you do have such a wasted period of time, you make up for it with a few solid hours of work as soon as you can. Get into the habit of writing at least a little bit every day, if at all possible, and you'll feel productive. You'll find it's easier to conjure up the mood to write when you need to, and you'll end up with enough time to revise your work and increase your chances of getting the A on your paper that you really want to earn. In our next program, we'll talk about one of the most important challenges you face when writing a research paper, especially if you haven't written one before. And that is figuring out exactly how to use all the facts, ideas and information that you've gathered in your research? When should you quote directly from a book or article you've read? When should you paraphrase? And when should you simply refer to a research source? And in all three cases, how do you make the research material fit gracefully and naturally into your paper so that the result is a piece of writing that sounds mature, professional, thoughtful, and scholarly? These are questions that most students don't know how to answer, but we'll help you conquer them. Meanwhile, thanks for watching and see you next time.
Even if you're class president, the star of the basketball team, and a nursing home volunteer, you'll probably find a rejection letter in your mailbox if your college admission essay is boring or poorly written. Now you can make your college application stand out from the crowd and end up at the top of the pile with video-aided instructions writing the perfect college admission essay. From advice on picking a topic to tips for sounding smart, this fun and easy-to-use program will teach you how to turn your admission essay into a showcase that really lets your personality shine through. Writing the perfect college admission essay can help you craft a memorable and impressive personal statement that sparkles with polish and panache.